Welcome to a Practice Pro CPD, brought to you by LawPro.
Hi, I'm Judah Stravchinsky, Director of Practice Pro, LawPro's Claims Prevention Program. Thanks for joining me for this talk on COVID-19 risks. In this module, we'll review how COVID has exacerbated certain risks and created new risks for lawyers. With so much change, lawyers need to pay particular care to service goals and to keeping on top of rapidly changing legislation. We'll also see how lawyers need to pivot to meet new risks caused by working from home and from fundamental shifts to client needs. We'll review how the changes that were catalyzed by COVID can also present opportunities and provide some resources to further assist you through the COVID pandemic emergency. As we've seen historically, the key risks have been around communication, inadequate investigation, time management, and mistakes in law. There are other key risks we've seen as well at LawPro related to cybersecurity and fraud. So let's talk about how COVID has shifted some of these risks. In communication and investigation of facts, we now have people socially distancing. And what that means for lawyers is that those one-on-one meetings, those made-for-TV specials where the client meets in the big boardroom with their lawyer, that's just not on right now. We're meeting online, we're using Zoom, and it's looking a lot different. So you need to learn about meeting netiquette and learning about how to host a client, how to deliver legal services via Zoom. And that requires building in time to allow a client to grow comfortable. Some clients will be very tech savvy and will be very happy to chat with you as if they were in your office, and there will be no issue setting up a trust relationship where someone is able to talk freely with you. In other situations, that won't be as easy. Think about when people come to seek the guidance of a lawyer. Imagine you need to have your will adjusted because you are sick and you don't know, but it may be that you're entering into the end of life stages soon, and you've decided to readjust or review your will. Talking about these very personal decisions can be very difficult for people online. It's hard enough in person, but it's very hard when it's by Zoom, and there may be buffering issues that makes it hard to read visual cues. It can be hard because that person is simply not physically there. It can be difficult, and so you need to give time for people to adjust and take the time to build a trusting relationship with a client. And that means asking lots of questions during your meetings, having open-ended questions, or allowing pauses where someone needs them, following their lead, and asking further follow-up questions as you need. What this means is that typical intake meetings where you may have learned about a client's needs might take longer. It may also mean, given Zoom fatigue, given people's schedules, given the need to gain comfort first with the platform, that you need to meet more than once. At practicepro.ca, we have checklists for how to hold a meeting with a client and provide legal services. We also have checklists for general netiquette for how to set up a Zoom or other online video conference meeting. But at the end of the day, the key communication points remain at the end to confirm in writing. We may be moving to a more visual and online world, but we still need those confirmation points, both to keep us on track and to make sure that the client understands where we're at in the relationship and next steps. Time management has been thrown for a real curve, and so you can see these curves in this slide. For starters, the limitation periods were suspended at the start of the COVID-19 emergency period. In the Ontario realm, that meant that all limitations and all procedural periods subject to court or tribunal decisions came to a halt. This was a pretty significant development, obviously, and we have yet to see what its full impacts will be. We'll probably get to know that over time once the courts fully reopen, the emergency passes, and the limitation periods are opened and renewed again. But through the COVID emergency, we've seen starts and stops. So construction law opened up early to allow for construction payments to continue, for construction projects to continue, for liens to continue to be a viable enforcement tool for trades and contractors. Contractual deadlines never went away. If you had a limitation period by contract, then that was still enforceable despite a suspension of the court-based limitation periods. We also saw changes in the limitation periods in family law, with certain enforcement tools being permitted again through the emergency period. And of course, if you had a dispute that crossed borders, there were different limitations decisions in all sorts of other jurisdictions. And the federal government and federal laws have been subject to different guidance. So limitation periods, which usually account for a significant part of the errors that we see or the claims reported, at the early time of COVID appears to have caused less problems for us from a claims perspective. But of course, it's early days, and when it opens up again, there will be other limitations. And as you enter into private practice, you might see cases where the limitation periods have been impacted and deadlines have been impacted by COVID. Time management, as I'm sure you know, as law students, has been significantly impacted by the pandemic. And this isn't just working from home for everyone, this is working from home while in the midst of a global pandemic. And so your normal productivity will likely be down. And there's need to onboard differently, to serve clients differently, to close files differently, to save documents differently, and to manage our time differently. Significant shifts to the practice of law, and no doubt many of those will be here to stay, so that by the time you enter private practice or practice generally, there will be much different types of processes in place in workplaces. Error of law will continue to be a heightened risk factor during COVID. In addition to rapidly changing client needs, we're seeing rapidly changing laws that lawyers need to constantly monitor for updates. Take employment law as one example. Government relief programs have fundamentally changed the calculus for employees and employers, but those programs have also been changing at times on a monthly basis. This requires constant vigilance by employers, employees, and their counsel, and counsel will likely need to shift their advice and recommendations over time given changes in programs. We'll talk about cybersecurity and fraud in a separate section, but for COVID, there have been some significant shifts in the risk in this area. We saw at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic that there were significant security risks in conducting business through video conferencing software and technologies. Zoom bombing was perhaps the most famous of those. That's when people who would get access to a meeting room would disrupt meetings in rather lewd ways. Thankfully, Zoom has taken significant steps to enhance security since the start of the pandemic, and there are all sorts of ways that people can make sure that their online delivery of legal services is done in a secure manner. We have tips about how to do so on practicepro.ca. We've also had shifts in what is permitted for lawyers identifying their clients and verifying their clients where necessary. And the Law Society of Ontario has developed new guidance. Lawyers needed to pivot in order to do so, but without being able to meet a client in person, there are increased risks of client identity theft or of other efforts to try to engage in fraudulent activity. There are particular areas of law where there are risks of undue influence or risks of fraud that are exacerbated. Shifts in wills, where a will is conducted online, there's always a risk, an increased risk of undue influence. Powers of attorney and real estate practices also have to be on guard for these types of risks. And of course, fraudsters have been using COVID-19 and the shifts in the resulting responses to try to part people from their money. We've seen fraudsters purporting to be charitable responses to COVID and purporting to be the WHO. For lawyers, we've seen, as some have rolled out new online services or new software upgrades, We've seen phishing scams, which we'll talk about in greater detail, but we've seen attempts through phishing scams to get lawyers to click on links that look like software rollouts. And so as risks shift in real time in response to the pandemic, we've seen fraudsters trying to take advantage of those changes in order to perpetuate frauds. Virtually overnight, we saw a shift from bricks and mortar practices to remote practice. And that was a fundamental change that we've seen in the early part of 2020. It's accelerated a trend where we have seen lawyers freed from their offices. It was perhaps the most significant change of the last decade to see that lawyers could get their work done from anywhere if they had the right technology. Lawyers could be working as long as they had internet and a VPN connection and the right software. That wasn't universally the practice, but 2020 has forced the vast majority to be able to do that in addition to return to bricks and mortar offices should they wish to in the future. And in some cases, because lawyers are essential services during the pandemic, some lawyers have continued to go to their offices during this time. But regardless of where we've been, it's interesting as well to note that although there are risks of practicing remotely, there are also significant opportunities. If practicing from your home or practicing without a formal bricks and mortar office, there must be consideration around how documents will be managed, how privilege and confidential information will be maintained, how you can make sure that you have an environment that facilitates client candor. But at the end of the day, if you're working from home or working remotely, there may be significant opportunities to lower your overhead. And in that case, you may be at an advantage point in the ability to serve clients at more affordable price points. And so, although the pandemic has been horrifying, the shift to remote practice does leave some hope that there will be new opportunities to serve clients more effectively in the future. As this discussion about COVID-19 demonstrates, the pandemic has introduced new risks and at times exacerbated existing risk areas for lawyers. More than ever, lawyers need to communicate with their clients, although during the pandemic, it was at times very difficult to do so. Time management will continue to be a major issue for lawyers as we all now need to carefully navigate new deadlines that arose during the pandemic. And lawyers generally will need to pivot to meet new challenges and new client and court expectations. Thankfully, there are practice supports to assist, and we're there to help. To learn more, here are a few additional resources. Visit practicepro.ca's Hot Topics section for the COVID-19 webpage. There you'll find resources related to using technology during the work from home period, fraud and cybersecurity during COVID, tips and updates by practice area, particularly civil litigation, real estate, and wills and estates, and links to mental health resources. You can subscribe to avoidaclaim.com to receive the latest updates on claims prevention and frauds facing the profession. Thanks very much for watching. Feel free to connect with me personally and follow LawPro and Practice Pro on Twitter. LawPro also is on LinkedIn. We look forward to staying in touch. Thanks very much.